Welcome to Kibbe on Liberty. We have revamped things out of necessity and I think out of the needs of our viewers. We're going to be talking about COVID-19 and all of the implications and all the things that you and I have to do to make sure that people are safe and that our economy and our liberties continue to flourish as we struggle with this. And of course, I'm going to start with some good old Clorox wipes. Let me wipe down all the surfaces to make sure that our thing is safe so our guest doesn't get infected via the internet. There we go. Nice. Okay. We need a little gallows humor as we deal with this. And today we have one of the best friends of the show, Congressman Thomas Massie. Welcome, Thomas.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me on your show. Don't give me any virus.
Yeah, we're virus-free here in voluntary quarantine. I'm a little bit jealous right now because I have voluntarily quarantined in the heart of Mordor. And I'm not sure that this is a safe place to be, even with my front door locked. I see that you're in the Shire.
I am in the Shire. I haven't quarantined per se, but it's generally good here in the Shire right now. And in Kentucky in general, compared to other states.
Yeah, and you're also a well-known, self-sufficient guy who produces your own energy and your own food. So I'm a little bit envious right now because I feel like that was a good decision on your part.
We don't hoard food because we make food. Like, we know where to get more of it.
Yeah.
But, and I hope we'll talk about that. Farmers need to be remembered during this whole lockdown situation.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that because you've made some important statements and things that I think a lot of people are overlooking in terms of how we're going to keep people fed as we keep them safe. And I think a lot of politicians and a lot of self-anointed smart people don't seem to understand much about the distributed way that we grow and produce and get food to the doors of people in big cities like where I am right now. But let's get a quick congressional update first. You guys are passing $1 trillion bills faster than I can keep track. There's already been 2 pieces of legislation passed, and you guys are about to consider a third. Can you tell me what, as best you know, what's going on?
Well, yeah, let me give a little bit of history. The first bill was an $8 billion bill, and it was to respond to the cause of all this, the coronavirus itself. And I voted for that bill. It had several things in it I didn't like, but I thought it was appropriate for the federal government to respond to the virus in a helpful way. There was a second bill which had a bigger price tag that required employers to give paid leave and whatnot to their employees. And I had some constituents in my district who were concerned about that bill. I didn't vote for that one. And there's going to be a third one now, and this is what the Senate is debating. The House is in recess right now, but the Senate is meeting. And I just heard that the Senate deal fell through, that Schumer and McConnell, whatever it was they were going to vote on, is no longer going to be voted on. So they think we'll have something in the next 48 hours that's probably going to have a price tag around $2 trillion. So it's certainly going to be in excess of $1 trillion. And there's a chance that the House will pass that by unanimous consent. Now that's pretty scary, if you ask me, to pass $1 trillion bill with nobody voting on it.
Yeah. Like, has there been any opportunity to read what's in this legislation, or is that just part of this process where Pelosi is making all the decisions for the rest of you?
Well, in the second bill, Congress was given like 30 minutes to read it. And we're supposed to have 72 hours. That's a House rule that we're supposed to get 72 hours. But people willingly suspend that rule. They vote to suspend that rule, and then they vote on the bill. And I suspect the same thing will be done here on this third bill, the $1 trillion plus bill. I expect there'll be a vote to suspend that rule but nobody will be there to object to that vote. So it'll just happen without a vote. The rule will be suspended, and in less than 72 hours, it could be a matter of minutes. They'll pass it, and that wouldn't give us time to get back to Washington, D.C. to object, for instance.
Yeah. Now, you've been sent home, and if you wanted to, could you go back and object, or is that just because of the sort of social distancing? I don't know what the rules are right now in terms of Congress.
Well, the Constitution says that we can't be stopped coming or going from Congress, right? That's a nice little part of the Constitution. Yeah. So regardless of what states have various lockdowns in place, you know, the Constitution says that I can travel to Washington, D.C. and back if I want to, if there's legislative business. So they couldn't stop you. The question is, when is it going to happen? We don't know when it's going to happen. They're basically a bunch of people in a room. Most of them aren't even elected officials. This bill. Then the elected officials get together with the special interests. And I think that's probably what's keeping this third bill from happening, is that every special interest is trying to get something in it right now. Yeah. And they're not all being, they don't all feel like they're represented. Everybody wants a bailout right now. And the problem with this legislation, by the way, Matt, it doesn't even allow our economy to start again. You can't stimulate an economy that's stopped, right? You just can't do it. It's like a car that's turned off and pushing on the gas pedal. It's still not going to go anywhere. You're just going to flood the carburetor.
Yeah. So I don't know the specifics of the bill, and maybe you don't as well, and they're going to drop a bunch of stuff in there, good, bad, or ugly, and then sort of spring it on the American people. But you do know, and you already mentioned this, that the big boys, the lobbyists, the corporate interests, they'll be bellied up to the bar first because they have that special access. But everything I see is a combination of corporate bailouts and suggestions of basically just dropping cash with a helicopter onto the economy in hopes that somehow kickstarted. And it's sort of a very gross caricature of the very worst forms of Keynesian economics. And as you say, if the economy shut down, if California and Ohio and New York and other states are just shutting down businesses left and right, it's not at all clear that any of that would have any good at all, particularly given that we're borrowing money that we don't have on top of a $23 trillion debt. It just seems like this is insane.
The part of Keynesianism that works is you can enslave your children, right? You can borrow money and spend it to stimulate the economy. And that usually works, right? But yeah. And I'm no fan of Keynesianism, okay? But I'm just saying that you can eat your seed corn and get nourishment from it, okay? But then when it comes time to plant the corn, there's nothing there, and you're killing off your next crop. Yeah. But in this case, I don't even think that's going to work, because you're going to have more dollars chasing fewer goods. Somebody asked me, are the fundamentals of our economy sound? This was a couple of days ago, and they were citing economic indicators. And I said, whoa. The fundamental of any economy is people get up and go to work, and they make something or provide a service. And that basic thing is not happening right now. So I don't care what macroeconomic thing you try, the microeconomics are broken. They're stalled. And until we get that going, it's not going to get fixed. You can dump any amount of money on it, and it's not going to start it back up. Now, a lot of people will take advantage of that bill. People will squirrel some of that money away. Companies will buy back their stock probably, that sort of thing, although they're trying to figure out how to circumvent that. That's not to say there aren't certain people that are going to benefit from this bill. I just think overall it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah.
The problem is the virus, right? Why don't we work on a bill that works on trying to solve this virus problem?
Has there been any serious legislative efforts to reduce regulatory barriers and and health regulation barriers to medical innovations. I just read a story today that I believe the FDA finally gave 3M permission to distribute medical masks that were made for construction, so hadn't been approved for medical use. But of course, hospitals and healthcare professionals and people that want to be more safe don't have access to these things. And I'm asking myself, why did we just get that done today? Is there any serious effort at reducing some barriers where people could act and help themselves?
I think there are a few rifle shots where they go in and they find one very specific thing that's gumming up the works, and they, provide some regulatory relief for that specific company in that specific circumstance. But what they need to do is just a widespread rollback of regulations in this area. And they better do it also on food production pretty soon. And people could argue, oh, you're going to make the food less safe. What food? What food is there going to be to eat if we keep the economy shut down for 3 months? Spring only comes once a year, in this country. So it's a problem. We should be rolling back regulations. We should be making it easier, by the way, for farmers to sell locally to consumers instead of this centralized process that requires all this shipping right now. There are a lot of regulations like that I think we could undo. One of the things that we've got to get out of the way, and I mean we, when I say we, I mean with my government hat on, is with the testing. We need more test kits. I've been saying there's the biggest lie the government ever says is the government and I'm here to help. The second biggest lie is that the N95 masks only work for healthcare professionals, that they don't work for civilians. And the third biggest lie is not everybody needs tested. We need to get to a situation where everybody who wants a test can get a test. And you can do that by unleashing the free market. Can you imagine if there was a test available right now, how many people would buy it? If it were, let's say, $100, that company would make obscene amounts of money, and then somebody would figure out how to sell it for $50. And pretty soon the test would be like one of those pregnancy tests that you can buy, at the pharmacy, or you could buy a 6-pack of these tests. And not only would everybody get tested, everybody could test every day. Like, that's one of the ways we're going to defeat this virus.
Yeah. And I mean, that's the everything that we're doing. And let's assume that most of it is well-intentioned. We just talk about the lobbyist feeding frenzy, and I do notice that every member of Congress who has had in the past a big government scheme, let's say bailing out college students, you could fill in the blank. There's giveaways for everything. They've suddenly rediscovered that this idea was perfectly designed for the contagion, and they're just filling the Christmas tree with that. But it strikes me that any one of those proposals is 100% centralized. It's requiring that only a few smart people sort of decide things for us. But what you're describing about when you talk about a free market approach is a radically decentralized approach that allows families and communities and innovators and healthcare professionals and fill in the blank to solve these problems from the bottom up. And it strikes me that the more widespread this threat becomes, the more we're going to have to rely on the common sense good ideas of people that are actually dealing with the problems.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the medical tools that are needed, why not let people 3D print those, right? Would you rather not have the medical facility or the medical tool, or would you rather have something that's 90%? I'd rather have the 90% solution, frankly, as to not have anything. And I think that's something that could be done as well, regulatory wise.
It sort of begs the bigger question when the dust settles, if regulating things out of existence, there's this phrase I think you may have heard called the precautionary principle. And it's this sort of hardcore regulatory state type approach that says we're not going to allow anything into the market until we can prove without a shadow of a doubt that it's 100% effective and 100% safe. And it takes years and years and millions of dollars to bring anything to market under that principle. And it appears to be that that is still sort of dominating the government mindset on how we deal with this virus. Very top down, and nobody wants to get blamed in case a mistake is made. So they're just not doing enough.
Right. There's another way to say that. No government regulator ever got fired for saying no. Like some have been fired for saying yes. And
Yeah.
so their bias is always to say no. But we're going to get to a point with this virus where a few government regulators might get tarred and feathered for saying no. You might not get fired, but there's definitely going to be some animosity toward them for stopping just common sense solutions and cures to this virus.
I mean, the governor of New York, Cuomo, said just a couple days ago, I mean, and if anyone's missed this, he has completely shut down the entire state of New York, one of the largest economies in the United States. And he said, if we save just one life, this will all be worth it. And that this is sort of a classic example of this. I don't want to get blamed for anything, so I'm going to take the most draconian action. I haven't really thought through the unintended consequences of what happens when I shut down entire economies, but that way I won't get blamed.
Profound economic ignorance, and it's going to lead to lots of deaths and lots of suffering when they just shut everything down. Our governor is doing similar things. You end up with these issues at the state borders. So, for instance, I have a company in my district today that contacted me and said, our governor says that essential companies can keep operating. And what they do is they print instructions for drugs, right? If you've ever opened a box or a bottle of drugs and from the drugstore or prescription, and you open it up and there's like that page that shows you everything on it, they print that. So they've been deemed essential. But guess what? A third of their employees live in Ohio, and Ohio's been told to shelter in place. So what happens when Ohio is sheltering in place and Kentucky, a company in Kentucky needs to print the labels for the drugs? And they might be tapped to print the labels for the cure that comes up, that somebody comes up with.
Yeah.
But if somebody's sheltered in place in another state and can't get to work because of that, because they're afraid they'll get pulled over and thrown in jail for it, then, how's that going to work? This is like a central planning dream for a central planner, but it's a nightmare in reality for everybody else that has to live under this. You literally have governors who are attorneys. They've never built anything in their life. They've never grown anything in their lives. A lot of them never run a company, and they're trying to tell us what's essential and what's non-essential in the economy. That's really dangerous.
Yeah, and by the way, everybody's definition of essential and non-essential is different, and the only thing that is the same is that economic ignorance that you just described. I don't think any of this is malice, but the inability to understand what a division of labor is and how complex and distributed our responsibilities are in a complex economy. And for some reason, and I think this might be sort of a cultural thing too, I think city folk have never really thought carefully about where the food that shows up on their front doorstep actually came from, and all of the people and functions that were required to get it there. So maybe talk about that, because you mentioned farmers.
Sure.
And you're from a farming state, and this affects you guys.
Well, it absolutely does. And I think some people who've never been to a big farm have this idealistic vision of what happens. The farmer gets up and the farmer's wife cooks biscuits, and he goes out and gets on his tractor and, makes the food or something. When in reality, most of the food is made on giant farms, right? And the farmer is a manager of a company, and he needs employees to show up to work that day or nothing happens, right? Like the scale of the farm is so huge the farmer is not going to go out there and get on his tractor. He's got, half a dozen combines and a whole crew, responsible for each one to keep everything going. And if those people don't show up to work because their kids can't get daycare, or if they go to the farm supply place to get the fertilizer to put on the field, and the employees aren't at the farm supply place to load the bulk fertilizer spreaders, you're in trouble. So, you got to really understand how farming works. Now, mine is a small farm. I have 65 cattle. So it might work more the way that people envision, except because of the stupid government regulations, in order to turn one of my animals into a hamburger, there's this big process involved. I can't go to the local butcher and have him process a beef for me. I have to drive 3 hours on the interstate to a place that looks like a factory and drop my cattle off. And then they go into this factory and they come out as hamburger with the USDA stamp on them. And that's what you have to go through. Now, what happens if the people don't show up to work at that factory because they couldn't get daycare, for instance? Or what happens if the hamburger grinder at that factory quits working and the machine shop is closed? All of that grinds to a halt. And our food production system is a little bit brittle in that way. It used to be more distributed, smaller farms, and farmers used to sell more of their goods locally. But as things consolidated, the companies that ended up as the aggregators, like the meat packers or the dairy cooperatives, they actually welcomed more regulation into their business because it became a barrier to entry for their competitors. And it made sure that the small farmer, instead of selling to consumers, went through that aggregator. And so the aggregators in this system love big government. They're cohabitants.
Yeah.
Literally, the USDA is sitting in the meat processor's plant.
Yeah.
And then the meat processor has a lobbyist sitting up at the USDA in Washington, D.C. And that's made our system more brittle because now all the food has to pass through just a few small points. And
So
when transportation breaks down, when daycare breaks down, when all of these things, the secondary and tertiary suppliers to those corporations break down, then the food supply stops.
Yeah. So this regulatory process that has centralized the agricultural economy has made us more vulnerable in times of crisis, and that'll only be exacerbated by some faceless bureaucrats' determination about what job is essential and what job is non-essential, not having any understanding of how that whole system you just described works.
That's right. And like I said, it's gotten more and more brittle. Now you can say, let's just relax the regulations and let this thing work itself out. Well, the regulations have already killed most of the small meat processors.
Right.
So that I had my wife call up our local meat processor. I was like, you know what? Screw it. Screw the USDA. We're going to get some of these cattle butchered, and we're going to sell them to people. And if they want to take me to jail for it, then screw it. So, but I called him up. Guess what? Everybody else has got the same idea, and he's backed up, for several weeks. And so we've got a brittle system with not enough people who can provide these services because they've already been regulated out of existence.
Yeah. And that's just production. And then you get to the question of how to get that food, assuming that farmers are allowed to farm. How do we get that food to the people that need it in times of crisis? And you were telling me a story earlier about trucking, for instance.
How do you get the food? Well, the government has deemed grocery stores as sort of essential businesses, so they can stay open and the pharmacies can stay open, but gatherings of 10 or more people are illegal. And so what about a farmer's market? What about your local farmer's market? I'm worried they're going to be, it's going to depend on the state.
They shut them down here in D.C.
You have it. There's your answer in D.C. They shut them down. So that's ridiculous. And here's the other thing, Matt, that happened here in Kentucky just a couple days ago, when they shut all the restaurants down abruptly, and they said, well, you can do takeout. Well, a lot of these restaurants aren't geared for a takeout and don't have drive-throughs, so they shut down. So this whole supply chain that's geared for supplying the restaurants with food just shut down, and millions of dollars of produce rotted because it's not packaged, for distribution in a grocery store, for instance. And those trucks don't go to those grocery stores. And so there was a crisis, and I'm sure you had that in every state. And I know a lot of food had to rot because of that. You don't get that back.
Right. And I'm worried about, you have this distributed supply chain, and the chain was full of stuff at the beginning of this crisis, but as more and more of these unanticipated, unintended consequences of these shutdowns, we're gonna have a problem worse than the virus. The cure may in fact be more dangerous than the virus.
Yeah, and not just, it's not like we're talking about the economic trade-off versus lives, okay? We're talking about lives versus lives.
Right.
Suicides are going to go up. I talked to a cardiac a cardiologist, day before yesterday, and he puts the stents in folks to keep them going. And he said, typically a day in the office, I see 4 patients, 3 of them are outpatients, and 1 of them is bad enough that they have to stay in the hospital. So it's an inpatient. He said that ratio is flipped. Now 3 of my patients on an average day are inpatients, and 1 is an outpatient. He said because they're showing up in worse health, more stressed out, not eating well, not exercising. They've been told that sitting on the couch is the best thing to do, by their government. And so people are gonna start dying from that. I guarantee it's already happened, right? Somewhere there's been a suicide over this, and nobody's reporting on that. And there's going to be more and more of those. People will be malnourished. There are, any number of things. People aren't going to get the insulin they need. You can go down the list, and it's going to get worse and worse. And that's from the cure. That's not from the virus. And that's, right. I'm not talking about trying to optimize an economy for profit. I'm talking about trying to optimize an economy for the most number of people who live, right, to maintain lives.
And just shutting down restaurants as an example, and it's a very narrow example because I think we've shut down a tremendous amount of businesses that support that entire consumer economy. These are all people that effectively just lost their jobs. So they don't necessarily have a way to pay for healthcare, to pay for food and shelter and electricity and all the things that we sort of take for granted in a modern economy. And I wonder what happens when unemployment benefits. I don't know how far you can go with that, because we're talking about essentially an unprecedented level of unemployment.
Yeah, I talked to another legislator who said, I could vote for just giving cash to people if we also turned the economy back on. But just giving cash to people is not going to solve their problem if there's nowhere to spend it.
Yeah.
And it's not sustainable. I mean, things are easy to turn off and hard to turn on.
Yeah. And I'm an economist. I'm not a politician. You're actually an inventor more than a politician. But I think it's very difficult to explain to people, particularly again, city folk. I don't think that people in cities see the distributed nature of the division of labor the way we do. So there's an economist I love who talks about the seen and the unseen. So they see certain things like the grocery store shelves filled at Whole Foods, but they don't see the unintended consequences of some of these actions. How do we explain that to people so that it doesn't sound like we don't care, about people that are at risk because of the virus, but we're worried about even more people dying if we shut this machine down.
That's part of the reason I came on your show, is to try and explain it. I don't know if we're going to be able to explain it to everybody. Um, People mostly get mad at you if you try to change their worldview. Even when you're just trying to be helpful, they get mad. They make you sound like the crazy person when you try to explain these things to them. I don't know what the best way to do it is. I mean, I've been on Facebook and Twitter and social media trying to explain it. But I think what might explain it is when they go to the grocery store, and instead of, and I know we've all seen the, you know, apocryphal pictures of the grocery stores are empty, but the reality is they're getting filled back up right now. Like,
right.
you know, they get that's at the end of the day, and they get restocked, and you can go back to the grocery store and are rationing, but there's food still coming back to the shelves. What happens when you go to the grocery store in the morning and the shelves are still empty? I think that's when the lesson is going to come home. Not just to, you know, I mean, you're picking on city folk, and that's a fun thing to do sometimes, but, and I know you can do that because you're a city folk, man. But
I'm definitely part of the problem.
Let me pick on, instead of picking on city folk or country folk, let me pick on my fellow politicians. These governors are going to learn a hard lesson about the economy. I think the one thing that's going to snap them back into reality is when they don't have enough revenue to pay their state workers because they've shut down the economy, and then they're going to suddenly remember, oh wait, we were taking, you know, depending on the state government, 5 to 15% of everything that was going on, and we just shut that down, so now we can't make payroll. And when the governors can't make payroll because they've taken away everybody else's livelihood, that may bring them back to reality. The problem is, I fear in this bailout, there's going to be more inducements to the governors to do this bad behavior of shutting down their economies. Like, if we incentivize governors to shut down their economies, even the good governors, the ones who've held out and tried to be rational, they're going to eventually economically be forced to do what the other governors have done, or coerced into doing it. I won't say forced. They still should have a choice.
So I noticed that a lot of folks, I won't name them by name because I'm not interested in shaming them, at least not yet, but I notice a lot of people are amazingly applauding the Chinese government's, the communist Chinese government's extremely command and control, almost violent lockdown of their economy and their people. And it seems more than a little bit ironic that that same government that covered up this virus as it emerged from Wuhan province, because they wanted to keep their power, that a lot of American smart people are thinking, hey, let's follow the Chinese model because they seem to really have a handle on things now. That's scary stuff.
First blush, it looks like dictators have an advantage in dealing with pandemics, right? They can tell people where to go, when to work, when not to work, what to eat. It seems like, you know, it's a little bit seductive in the beginning, like the dictators have the best hand dealt to them in a pandemic. But let's not forget, the dictators of the world have killed millions of people, right? That's the other constraint that's not upon them. Since they typically can control the news outlets and whatever, they can get away with all sorts of things. I've encouraged people not to give up on freedom and liberty and the free market and capitalism. Like, we have an advantage. We've always had an advantage in every crisis, and we've always come out ahead or better off than the dictatorships, not because we emulated them, but because we went in the other direction and we empowered people, not governments, to solve these problems. And that's what I think we should do.
Let's talk about that, because we've been painting this dire scenario where it seems like governors, particularly the ones shutting down their economies, And there's plenty of federal legislators taking the same approach. The dire consequences of that kind of behavior can be catastrophic for American families. And you're suggesting that freedom and individual responsibility and a more decentralized approach is better. From what I've read, South Korea, as compared to China, has taken a less command and control, more voluntary approach to containing the virus and keeping their economy alive. Explain how that would work in practice here in the United States.
Well, I think there are a lot of things we could be doing differently than we are right now. Instead of shutting down schools completely, we could have reduced the ridiculous rule here in Kentucky where you have to have 80% attendance or you don't get money from the state to keep your school system going. Like if we just got rid of that one rule and the school systems could have operated with 30% attendance, the probability of spreading this virus at a school would go down dramatically if only 30% of the kids showed up. And by the way, that's probably the number of kids that on average, I mean, it varies by school district, but on average, that's probably the number of kids who depend on school to get a meal every day, right? That's and added to the number of kids whose parents have no other option for daycare. They don't have the money to hire daycare and pay their taxes, which are funding the school. By the way, I've noticed nobody suspended the school tax. They've closed down the schools, but they haven't suspended the school tax and given you a credit to go pay for daycare. But if they had kept the schools open at, let's say, a much reduced attendance rate of like 30% and made school optional, I think we could have not caused the daycare crisis. We could have not caused the crisis where kids may not be getting enough food to eat, and we could have attenuated the spread of this disease. The same thing with restaurants. So a lot of states, the state here in Kentucky and one across the river in Ohio, they shut down restaurants, dine-in, the dine-in aspect of the restaurant. Well, instead of shutting them down completely, there were a lot of things they could have done that made sense, but they didn't do. So for instance, when I'm overseas, and I'm not going to pick on any countries, but in countries where people famously come back with certain, gastrointestinal ailments, when I go to those countries, I only order hot food. I don't eat the salad. I don't eat the fresh vegetables. I know this sounds unhealthy, but it's a lot healthier than not eating. And it's a lot healthier than shutting down our economy. You could have told restaurants, okay, you have to serve all your meals hot, and they have to come out on a hot plate. And by the way, nobody's drinking out of a glass that's being poured into from a pitcher anymore. When you serve somebody, you're going to serve it in a bottle or some other container. And we could have allowed the elderly to come in between the hours of 5 and 7 for dinner. And then everybody, under the age of 60 could have come in to eat after 7 p.m. There are a lot of things that we could have done differently instead of just shutting down the whole restaurant system. And then finally, people are used to going to work, and as a condition of work, they wear safety equipment. I've been in a lot of factories in my district. Some of them require you wear a hairnet if you're in food production. Some of them require you to wear safety goggles if you're in a machine shop. If you're in a construction site, you wear a hard hat. Why not say, why not add to that list of things that people wear to work or at work, a mask? There's some places where you wear a mask at work already. Instead of shutting down the whole business, how about propping the doors open so people don't have to touch the door handles? How about if it's a door that needs shut, station somebody there and have them open the door and shut the door for people if you don't have an automatic door opener, right? There's just so many common sense things we could have done to slow the spread of this virus, because nobody's pretending we're going to stop the spread of this virus. These are all about strategies to slow the spread of this virus. And there's lots of things we could have done without shutting down the economy to achieve that. We could have brought in UV lights and put more UV in the HVAC systems to kill viruses and other bacteria that might circulate through the HVAC. So many different things we could have done instead of just shutting down our economy, which is going to cause so much pain and suffering.
And one of the things that I very much believe, and I see this in the behavior of my friends and neighbors, that you don't have to force people to behave in a way that's in their personal interests and in their community's interests at the point of a gun. We're naturally going to be more cautious. We're naturally going to do as much social distancing and even self-quarantining as is possible. I'm doing it. All my friends are doing it. I'm insisting that our little staff of employees do it right now. The reason you and I are on Skype instead of in the studio is in large part because my team is all working remotely right now, and my wife and I had to figure out how to set this up with some of our team. But of course, we're in the information economy, and going back to it's not city folk versus country folk, but I do think there's a cultural divide between those of us that work in, I call it the information economy, but it's all technology, very important part of our economy. And we have a certain privilege, if you will. We can work remotely. We can do a lot of the things that we've always done, being totally isolated from other people, but in large part because we don't get our hands dirty. We're not in the dirt. We're not working with other people that are producing things. And we need to make sure that those people are free to make responsible decisions as well, but we don't know what those best decisions are.
No, and employers wanted, the employers I've talked to want to do the right thing. They would like to test their employees, for instance, not for the benefit of the boss, but for the benefit of all the employees who are there. Yeah. If your workforce is sick, then you're not going to have a productive business. And so employees have an incentive also or employers have an incentive to keep their employees healthy. And I think we need to get to this point quickly where you can screen employees, and the ones who aren't, contagious can come to work.
Yeah. I've read that even nurses can't get tests right now. And I feel like this is an example of where just unfettered free market capitalism would solve this problem if we would just get out of the way and make testing ubiquitous and available. I don't feel like this is rocket science, but if it involves a bunch of federal and state and even global bureaucrats, it's never going to get done.
I know, and I think I've already mentioned this, but we need to quit lying to people and saying that people don't need tests. Like, that's a big fat lie. And we need to quit lying to people and saying that, respirators and dust masks and whatever won't work for everyday people, that they only work for healthcare professionals. It's okay to be honest. It's okay to say, you know what? All of these things are important, but we have scarcity now, and so we need to prioritize. And that's okay to say that. And that way, when the free market solves this problem and people rush in with more of the personal protective gear and more of the tests, now everybody can get those tests.
Okay, so we're running out of time here. I really appreciate you taking the time and being part of this great social experiment where we can have a personal conversation. And we're 4 states away right now. Again, sort of envious of the Shire there. It looks like a safer place to be than where I'm at. But thank you, Congressman Massie, and be safe. And please keep fighting for the things that are going to keep us really safe.
All right, I'm gonna fight for the things that keep us safe, and I'm gonna fight for the things that will allow people here in Kentucky to keep their jobs and to keep their businesses, because I'm concerned right now that what's coming out of Washington, D.C., the cures that are being proposed are worse than the disease. And so I'm trying to be a voice of reason here. Hopefully I don't get beat up too badly, but when it's all over, I hope people will see that I was doing the right thing.
Just don't read the comments on Facebook and you'll be fine.
or the headlines in the local newspaper.
Oh man, yeah. Well, it's political season, so things are going to get silly.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.